This decision, therefore, reflects the Commission's commitment to upholding constitutionalism while safeguarding the integrity and preparedness of the electoral processes. Boundary delimitation, ladies and gentlemen, is a cornerstone of Kenya's representative democracy. It operationalizes the constitutional principle of one person, one vote, one value, by ensuring that the electoral units that we have in this country respond to population dynamics and evolving geographical realities. The Constitution, therefore, obligates the Commission to periodically review electoral boundaries to promote equitable representation and to prevent voter dilution. It is in that regard that the Commission is mandated to undertake these periodic reviews and delimitation of electoral boundaries in order to align population and, of course, the principles of representation in a democracy such as ours. Following the conclusion of the first boundaries review in 2012, the Commission subsequently developed the Boundaries Review Operations Plan 2019 to 2014 that outlined the methodology, timelines, data requirements, and public participation framework to guide the second review cycle. Consequently, significant preparatory work has been undertaken since 2019 to date. And this includes, of course, developing the strategy for the boundary review. As you know, it's a very complex issue. Undertaking comprehensive situational analysis, pilot studies, acquisition of GIS and geolocation systems, training, and capacity development of IEBC in order to undertake this complex and comprehensive exercise. However, despite the steps taken by the previous Commission towards undertaking comprehensive electoral boundary reviews, the process encountered serious constraints, which I believe you are aware of some of them. These constraints materially affected the pace and the timely completion of the boundary delimitation exercise. And as you are aware, we have already exceeded the constitutional timelines, which requires us to undertake the boundary delimitation between 8 to 12 years. So the last review was to be completed by March 2024, and those timelines have since passed. So we have outlined some of the constraints that have affected the boundary review process, and that's where we are. Absence of commissioners, as you are aware, after the previous commission left office in 2023 January, the IEBC remained without commissioners from that moment up to 11th July 2025, when these new commissioners assumed office, which is barely 6 months ago. And therefore, in the absence of commissioners, the Secretariat alone had to pause some of those activities that required policy decisions and oversight by commissioners. For example, the boundary review operations plan that I've spoken about required the Commission to relook and to review, and in the absence of the commissioners, that policy paper could not have been extended. And of course, there were other activities that required policy directives. So that was one of the main constraints to the timely review of the boundaries, electoral boundaries. Number two, we also had a hurdle in the form of judicial invalidation of the census data of 20 2019. So there are active cases that have affected the validity of the census data for 14 out of 17 constituencies in the 3 counties of Garissa, Wajir, and Mandera. On the 28th January 2025, the High Court in Garissa, in petition number 4 of 2020, in Sheikh and others versus Kenya National Bureau of Standards and IEBC, invalidated the 2019 Kenya Population and Housing Census data for the 3 counties, finding that the census process failed to meet the requisite legal and procedural standards. The Court of Appeal subsequently directed that the matter be maintained in status quo pending the determination of the Civil Appeal number 236 of 2025. So the matter is in the Court of Appeal, and therefore this rendered the affected census data unusable for official purposes by government agencies such as IEBC. So the 2019 data cannot be used by IEBC insofar as that case, that directive of the court is concerned. The Commission needs that data. It needs a valid and legally binding Kenya Housing and Population Census report for it to use that report and that data in determining what is called the population quota. As you are aware, we have 290 constituencies, we have 1,450 wards. And for us to determine the population quota currently, we need that data for us to work with. So for us to publish the preliminary report, because the boundary review process requires that we publish a preliminary report and a notice of intention to delimit electoral boundaries, that data is very, very critical. So until the courts resolve that issue of that population census report and the litigation around that is resolved, we can therefore not use that data for the discharge of our mandate. And therefore, our work to that extent will remain hindered. Another issue that has affected the boundary delimitation process is, of course, exposure to legal risks in boundary reviews. The Commission continues to face litigation arising from the delays to conduct and complete the boundary review and delimitation exercise. As you are aware, as late as last year, 2025, the Commission has been sued by a section of Kenyans demanding for orders to compel the Commission to undertake the boundary delimitation ahead of the August 2027 general election. And therefore, we are saying this continued litigation poses a risk to our work, and depending on the outcome of the cases now and that might be filed in future, it is a risk that we as the Commission are aware of and are alive to. Fourth, the advisory opinion of the Supreme Court last year, before we assumed office, the Supreme Court rendered its advisory opinion in this matter and directed that the Commission must apply its mind on this issue and must make a decision on which way forward. And the timeline, of course, it took for us to receive that advisory opinion, and the uncertainty around the constitutional issues and timelines, and the absence of commissioners, as I've said before, and the pronouncement that the Secretariat alone could not, in the absence of commissioners, undertake any boundary reviews. Those are some of the risks, so those are some of the factors that impacted negatively on the comprehensive delimitation of the boundaries. As we move forward, you are aware, as Kenyans, that we have other competing electoral priorities. Elections and indeed boundary delimitations are complex processes involving multiple stakeholders and involving multiple stages. The Commission is currently managing critical electoral cycle activities, including by-elections, which we completed the bigger part in November last year. We still have a few more by-elections in Mbeere. We have others in Malava, and of course, Isiolo. And we are also managing continuous voter registration. We are also dealing with institutional reforms. There are a number of laws which we are currently working on to be presented to Parliament. We are also dealing with the challenges around voter education and stakeholder engagement as we prepare for the 2027 general elections. So therefore, what we are telling the nation is that undertaking full delimitation alongside these other competing and equally critical obligations would create significant operational bottlenecks and may, and I insist, may compromise the overall electoral preparedness for the 2027 general election. While therefore aware of such constraints, the Commission has made a decision to undertake limited and phased activities towards electoral boundary reviews without compromising the quality and the level of preparedness for the upcoming general election, which is fast approaching. So the operative word is we have made a decision to undertake phased activities and limited activities towards the boundary delimitation without compromising our levels of preparedness for the 2027 general election. And of course, in our press release, we have explained what a phased approach means. So we have made that decision well aware of the time constraints that we have. And as guided by the Boundary Review Operational Plan, a full delimitation generally requires about 2 years. Experts will tell you, and we have our Professor Francis Adol here, it takes 2 years for us to complete that comprehensive delimitation exercise. And of course, we are aware of the limitations placed by the Constitution as well, under Article 89.4, that requires that a boundary review that is intended to be applied in the general election, for example, the 2027 general election, must be completed at least 12 months before that election. So we have challenges in terms of meeting those constitutional timelines, and I've explained the factors that led to that. The absence of the commissioners to undertake the policy decisions and oversight around the boundary review, and of course many other factors that I've outlined. So in light of the constraints and that we have observed above and the constitutional obligations of the Commission, we have also sought advice from the Attorney General previously, and subsequently we also received the advisory opinion of the Supreme Court. And we have, in arriving at our decision of using the phased approach to undertake the boundary reviews, we have taken into account all those advisory opinions. And of course, the matters that I've told you are currently pending before the court on that issue of the population, the National Population Census report. So taking into account, therefore, the constitutional requirements under Article 88 and 89, which articles have placed that mandate and function in the hands of this commission, and of course the statutory framework that is governing delimitation, including the IEBC Act, Schedule 5, and of course all the advice that I've spoken about, and more importantly, the doctrine of constitutional necessity and binding judicial decisions on data. We have extensively deliberated on this issue, And as a result of all that, taking into account all those factors, the Commission has resolved that a phased approach is the most constitutionally sound and legally defensible course of action. And therefore, this approach will enable us, as the Commission, to meet our constitutional obligations on boundary reviews by helping us to advance our preparatory work while also monitoring the outcomes of the litigation processes that are currently pending before court on that particular issue of population census. In particular, the Commission will defer those processes that will require use of the National Housing and Population Census report pending the conclusion of that matter. While that remains the case, IEBC will progressively and continuously implement other activities that are not affected by any litigation. Those activities will be undertaken in a phased approach while also taking into account the time constraints and the resource requirements. Because we have a general election that will also require massive resources, and the boundaries delimitation process is also a complex process that will also require financial resources to undertake. So a phased approach will ensure that we immediately upscale those activities that we have agreed on, upscale them, including, of course, geodata collection, validation, capacity building, and acquisition of requisite tools. That phased approach will also ensure that we undertake these activities for this second review of the boundaries, while also monitoring our levels of preparedness for the 2027 general election. And when the time comes, the Commission will again look at where we are and make a determination and a decision whether to scale down those activities on boundary review to allow the Commission to fully focus and concentrate on delivering a credible, free, and fair general elections 2027. And of course, after the elections, the Commission will again take a decision on when to resume those activities around boundary delimitation to ensure that those activities are commenced forthwith to ensure that we conclude that process after the 2027 general election. So we are therefore telling Kenyans that substantive boundary delimitation will be undertaken after the general election using the legally and nationally applicable population census. As we've said, and I will repeat again, the 2019 census is a matter that is in court, and yet the Commission requires that data for us to publish what is called a preliminary report of boundary delimitation, and for us to publish a notice of intention to delimit electoral boundaries. And in the absence of that data, in the absence of that report, then we cannot be, our hands are tied and we cannot progress. Finally, the Commission further notes that there have been enormous interests by politicians and citizens in the delimitation of boundaries, with the legitimate expectation that the number of constituencies will be increased. Since we assumed office, we have received petitions and presentations to the Commission where we have our politicians and citizens requesting if their constituencies and wards could be split to take into account, of course, concerns such as the increase in populations and, of course, other means, including the geographical factors and means of communication. While we take note of these demands and legitimate expectations from Kenyans, we, however, wish to inform the public and Kenyans in general that the Constitution under Article 89(1) places a cap on the number of constituencies Currently, Kenya has 290 constituencies, and that number, the commission, even if we were to conclude this boundary review ahead of the 2027 general election, and I say if, we cannot increase these constituencies beyond the 290. Neither can we reduce them to below 290, because it's the Constitution that capped them, that placed them at 290, nothing more, nothing less. So would like to inform Kenyans that any boundary review process will look at is reviewing the names of those constituencies and the boundaries. We can change the boundaries to ensure a constituency with a large number can accommodate, with a smaller number can accommodate some populations from that constituency which carries more populations. But we cannot change the number of constituencies. For wards, yes, there is a contradiction currently. We have the Constitution which gives the Commission the mandate to determine the number of wards, to determine their names, and of course their boundaries. And it has not placed any cap. But the County Governments Act has capped wards at 1,450. So again, there is the conflict between the County Governments Act and the Constitution of Kenya. So that's an issue that we have flagged, and we hope that Parliament will address that issue by amending the relevant law so that then it removes that contradiction in the law. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are aware, of course, Kenyans have been waiting for this decision. It's a weighty one. And we in this new commission have endeavored to apply our minds. We have endeavored to look at all the factors, including what caused the delays, including the timelines we have to deal with, including the litigation that is impacting our work. And we've made what we believe is the right decision, and that decision does not in itself stop the delimitation process. We are continuing. There's a lot of work that Kenyans need to understand, and that work requires adequate preparation, early preparation. We need data, we need the tools, we need the training, we need the capacity, and we are proceeding with those processes that that are not affected by litigation, and that we hope in time we should be able to conclude this process accordingly and guided by the law. I thank you very much.
In regards to the limited boundaries, what if someone goes to court to a general election and say that this process also to have gone hand in hand with the electoral process and it has not been achieved by the commission? Is that ground enough for election petition?
Thank you very much for that question. I think even currently, as of last year, I think towards the final quarter of the year, there is a case that has been filed in court. It's active. Again, asking the courts to look at the issues around boundary delimitation and whether they can affect the general election. So that's an active matter that I don't want to delve into the facts. But yes, I know the concern is, yes, we needed to have concluded the boundary delimitation ahead of the general election. But then, of course, I've explained the factors that led to where we are now, which, of course, we need to face as a nation, and that we have to weigh whether we stop everything else because the boundary delimitation, the timelines and the constraints we have explained, or whether we should plan with the best case scenario, which is to continue doing the many activities. By the way, boundary delimitation is not something you just wake up and delimit. It is a complex process. It requires a lot of GIS mapping. It requires a lot of, boundaries are very emotive. They require us to engage with the public. They will require us to have stakeholder participation at the ward level, at the county level, at the constituency level, at the national level. And along the process, if you look at in our presser, which we'll share with you the final copy later, we have explained the various phases and the likely risks that we are likely to face. For example, even if we publish a preliminary report and somebody challenges it in court, that will take time again before the courts determine. And when we are looking at best case scenario, for example, even if this commission was to do it by now, we are supposed to complete it by July this year, so that then you can use this outcome for the 2027 general election. So, but if you work backwards from July, we barely have 3 months for us to do it. So it's an impossibility. And we need to be honest with Kenyans, because that's what we saw that ought to serve Kenyans without fear or any favor. So for us, there is that possibility. We can't preempt it. Kenyans, we are a very litigious society. So for us, we are planning on a scenario where we do the best we can under the circumstances. We continue with the activities, and then while focusing also on the general election. After that, then we will resume and proceed to complete maybe within a year or even later or two. Yeah.